December 8, 1941, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. The room was filled with celebration. Officers congratulated one another, their laughter echoing through the corridors as they reveled in the triumph of the morning's news. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat silently, his face calm, his thoughts elsewhere. Through the window, he could see junior officers waving newspapers, proud of what they believed to be a decisive victory. The attack on Pearl Harbor had gone perfectly, or so they thought. Yet Yamamoto, the architect of that very plan, felt no pride. Only a cold dread crept through him. He had lived in America once, studied at Harvard, traveled through Detroit's automobile plants, stood among the oil fields of Texas that stretched beyond sight. He knew the machine that Japan had just provoked. And now, as the celebrations swirled around him, his own words from 6 months earlier echoed like prophecy. "I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." Those words, once a warning, now felt like a sentence. Pearl Harbor was operationally brilliant. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. America's Pacific Fleet stunned, yet the American aircraft carriers, the true core of naval power, had escaped. Worse, Japan's strike had done something far more dangerous than damaged ships. It had unified a divided America. Overnight, a nation that had debated isolation turned toward total war. And in that moment, the mathematics of Japan's defeat were already written. What Yamamoto saw, what few others could grasp, was that this single act had awakened the most powerful industrial engine in human history. A nation whose factories, resources, and ingenuity dwarfed everything Japan possessed. The Japanese High Command could calculate battles. They could measure fleets. But what they could not comprehend, what they refused to comprehend, was the true magnitude of what America could build. Once it was fully awake, the road to catastrophe had begun long before Pearl Harbor. Throughout the 1930s, Japan had expanded relentlessly. Manchuria in 1931, China in 1937, Indochina by 1940. Each conquest driven by a single idea. Japan must secure the resources it lacked: oil, rubber, tin, rice, to build a self-sufficient empire. But in chasing this dream, Japanese leaders ignored the one truth that would define their fate. Their industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. In 1937, Japan held just over 5% of the world's industrial power, about the same as France. America, by contrast, commanded over 40%. Even in the depths of the Great Depression, American industry was 7 to 10 times larger. These figures weren't secrets. Japan's planners knew them. They discussed them. And still they chose to gamble. Their strategy depended on speed. They would strike first, seize everything they could, and build a defensive perimeter so vast that America would find it too costly to reclaim. They believed that the United States, soft, commercial, unwilling to suffer, would negotiate. It was a gamble born not of ignorance, but of arrogance, and it would destroy them. Admiral Yamamoto had tried to warn them. He had walked American factory floors and seen assembly lines turning out cars faster than Japan could produce rifles. He had stood beneath oil rigs in Texas, where a single field produced more fuel than all of Japan. He had understood better than anyone that Japan could not win a long war. But by 1941, he was surrounded by men who believed otherwise, men who saw spirit as stronger than steel and courage as a substitute for coal. So, Yamamoto, knowing the risk, crafted a plan, a lightning strike to the Pacific Fleet and buy time. The attack on Pearl Harbor was that desperate move, and for 6 months it worked. The rising sun swept across Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines fell. Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Everywhere the Japanese advanced, victory followed. Oil, rubber, and rice began flowing toward the home islands. From the map room in Tokyo, it looked as though the empire had achieved the impossible. But Yamamoto knew maps could lie. In April 1942, a small American retaliation shattered the illusion. 16 bombers, B-25s launched from the USS Hornet, roared across Tokyo in the Dittle raid. The damage was minor, but the psychological blow was devastating. The Japanese homeland, thought untouchable, had been struck. Embarrassed and furious, the Japanese command decided to extend their perimeter to draw America into a decisive battle. That decision would lead them to Midway. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway. Yamamoto's plan was precise: lure the American carriers into a trap and finish what Pearl Harbor had started. But fate had other plans. Unknown to Tokyo, American code rears at Station Hypo had cracked Japan's naval cipher. They knew exactly where the strike would fall. As the Japanese fleet moved toward Midway, American carriers lay in wait. The battle that followed lasted just 3 days, but it changed everything. When it ended, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru, burned and sank beneath the waves. Over 3,000 sailors were lost. Japan's elite naval aviators, the pride of the empire, were gone. And with them sank Japan's hopes for victory. The loss was not just of ships, but of time. Time Japan could not afford. Because even as the wreck settled on the ocean floor across the Pacific, the sleeping giant Yamamoto had feared was stirring to full strength. In 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt made a promise that seemed impossible. 60,000 aircraft in 1 year wandered 125,000 the next, 120,000 tanks, tens of thousands of guns. Few believed it could be done, but it was, and more. Factories. Once building cars now turned out bombers. Shipyards launched aircraft carriers faster than Japan could even design them. America built 17 Essex-class carriers in the time Japan produced 6. The Ford plant at Willow Run rolled out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. By 1944, America was producing more aircraft in a single year than Japan had in the entire war. For Japan, the war became a slow, motion collapse. Submarines strangled its shipping lanes. Oil tankers never reached home. Pilots died faster than they could be trained. Factories lacked steel, electricity, and fuel. While American planes grew faster, stronger, deadlier, Japan's legendary Zero fighters stayed the same. Relics of an earlier war. At Guadalcanal, the illusion of Japanese superiority began to crumble. For 6 brutal months, both sides bled over a tiny island. But America's advantage in logistics, in simple resupply, turned the tide. Japan could no longer sustain its soldiers. For every crate of ammunition they sent, America sent 1,000. By 1944, the tide had become a flood. The Marianas fell. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, each one captured with overwhelming firepower. And from those islands came the bombers, the B-29 superfortresses, that would bring war directly to Japan's cities. Then came the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, nearly 500 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Imperial Navy's air arms ceased to exist. From that point forward, the war was no longer a contest. It was annihilation. By 1945, American bombers flew unopposed. Tokyo burned in March under a rain of incendiaries. 100,000 dead in one night. Entire cities vanished. The factories, homes, and streets of Japan turned to ash. Still, the government refused surrender. Army hardliners clung to delusion. That spirit could still triumph, that one miraculous victory might turn the tide. But Yamamoto's warning had come true long before his own death in 1943. Japan was out of oil, out of steel, out of time. Then the Soviet Union entered the war on August 8, 1945, crushing Japan's armies in Manchuria within days. Hiroshima had already fallen to the first atomic bomb. Nagasaki followed, yet even then some generals argued to fight on. Only when Emperor Hirohito himself spoke, breaking centuries of tradition, did Japan finally surrender. His broadcast on August 15, 1945 was calm, distant, but final. The war situation, he said, has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For the first time, the Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor and the truth that their empire had ended. In the ruins that followed, American soldiers arrived, young men carrying chocolate, cigarettes, and machines Japan had never seen. For many Japanese, it was their first glimpse of what Yamamoto had always known, that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in its astonishing capacity to build. In post-war trials, even Japan's leaders admitted it. Hideki Tojo, the general who had led Japan into war, told investigators, "We did not adequately understand American potential." Others confessed that they had known the numbers, but could not bring themselves to believe them. Japan's defeat had been decided not in the skies over Midway or the streets of Tokyo, but in the forges, factories, and shipyards of a nation whose industrial will was beyond imagination. By the end, America had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 2 million trucks, over 5,000 warships. Japan had produced a fraction of that and paid the price in lives and cities. More than 2.88 million Japanese soldiers died, nearly 1 million civilians, and all for a war that in truth could never have been won. When the fires finally burned out and the empire lay in ruins, Japan's leaders and its people began to understand what Yamamoto had seen that December morning. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had crushed them not out of hatred, but with the sheer unstoppable force of industrial reality. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt not through conquest, but through trade, science, and innovation. The empire that once sought domination through war became a nation that conquered the world through technology, precision, and peace. The story of Japan's high command is a story not of ignorance but of self-deception. The numbers were known, the warnings were given, but pride, that oldest enemy, made men believe spirit could overcome steel. History proved otherwise. And so, as Admiral Yamamoto once feared, the sleeping giant awoke and, filled with terrible resolve, reshaped the world forever.